Hello, everyone, and welcome. Per tradition, I will give it about 2 more minutes, 1 more minute before we officially start. I want to welcome all of you, and great to see so many of you still so interested and engaged. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and begin. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. Today is October 30th, and once again, I've realized that telling you ahead of time what we're going to talk about can sometimes be a little bit misleading or a mistake because news happens so quickly, and the things that I think are going to be the top story might not necessarily be it. However, in this case, I do have one main story I really want to focus on. We're going to get to it in a few minutes, and that is the question of how this could possibly have happened in the first place. Every Israeli has been asking, and Jews around the world have been asking, how is it possible that the mighty Israeli army, Israel's incredible intelligence network, how did they miss this one? And the evidence is beginning to come out. We're starting to see exactly what happened. And in fact, the story isn't quite what we thought it was. So I'm going to shed light on that in a few minutes. First, I want to just
Do you
bring
want to
up a
watch
few
this or
other.
not? This is
Hey
the
guys,
guy about Israel.
Yeah,
if you could,
of course.
if you could please mute yourselves. Some of you took yourselves off mute. It's really important to be muted. That way we all don't hear your conversations. Okay. So before we get to that main story, I do want to look at a few of the smaller stories that Israelis are talking about. As always, my goal is to show you sort of the Israeli psychology right now, what's on Israelis' minds. Number one, we have to talk about the hostage situation. Unbelievably, the number of hostages actually is going up, despite the fact that 5 are actually out of captivity. Why 5? Well, we knew that there were 2 initially released, a mother and a daughter from Illinois. I happen to be in Evanston, Illinois right now, very close to where the original 2 are from. And then 2 older women were released last week. Their husbands are still in captivity, so that was 4. But last night, a soldier was rescued. One of the soldiers who was being held in Gaza was rescued during one of the IDF's raids in Gaza. And I don't know anything more than that. None of the Israeli public does. I think one reason that we don't know more is we saw what happened last time. A hostage was released. And one of these older women from the South gave a press conference where she placed the blame squarely on the government and Bibi Netanyahu. And she talked about how her Hamas captors actually treated her nicely. And she shook the hand of one of her captors as she left. And it was and I personally, and most Israelis agree that this was not some sort of thing that she was forced to do in order to protect her husband who's still in captivity. But these were her genuine feelings. And the thought amongst Israelis is, wow, this is just an epic failure of mismanagement. No one from the government had briefed her on what to say, what not to say. And so I'm not surprised that after this soldier has been released, she was immediately questioned by the military. She talked to authorities. They did say that what they learned from interviewing her may help them rescue other hostages. Again, I do not know why they are saying this. It would seem to me that that would be a signal to Hamas, start moving people around. I don't know why they need to say this, but in any case, they are very clamped down on what they're letting out. It is good news, though, that this hostage has been recovered. Her name is Private Ori Megidish. She's a tatzpitanit, and a tatzpitanit is actually a very important role in the army, and this is going to come up later in the conversation, which is why I want to mention it now. Tatzpitaniyot, these are often women, almost always young women, who sit on the border in the Golan Heights, in Gaza, and their job is to watch closed circuit television screens, use some listening devices, and their job is to pay attention to the border. And when Hamas infiltrated on October 7th, they were able to kill and capture a number of tatzpitaniot, a number of these young women whose job it is in the army to overlook the border. And we'll talk about their role a little bit more later on. But it is good news that she's released. But and there's also been a propaganda video that came out. I don't know if this is news in the US, but a propaganda video was released by Hamas with 3 female hostages varying in ages from, I think, mid-40s-ish with 3 kids up to grandmother. And these were 3 women who criticized the government in the video, the Israeli government, and demanded some sort of prisoner exchange immediately. It's widely believed that they were saying what they were forced to say by Hamas. No one is taking this at face value. However, this video and also the rescue of the hostage, it's not a clear-cut positive thing necessarily. On the one hand, it's very positive because it means that we can get hostages out alive, that maybe the raids are working. But there is another side to the story, and that is the side that is very confusing. Israel is there's a big debate in Israel right now amongst Israelis and even within the military itself of how much do we pay attention to the hostages and how much do we go forward on our mission to dismantle Hamas and behave as if the hostages aren't there. And what we're seeing right now is it does seem like Israel is taking a middle ground and trying to aggressively go into Gaza. They've made it all the way to the outskirts of Gaza City, which is significant. But at the same time, they are not engaging in a massive ground operation the way a lot of people thought they would by day 23, day 24 of the war. So I think Israel is still feeling it out and still trying to decide for itself how much it's going to attempt to bring home all 230 plus. That's the number now, more than 230 hostages home safely, and how much it needs to be aggressive and allow some of the hostages to be casualties, as sad as it sounds to put it like that. So this rescue of a hostage is a little bit confusing because it complicates the issue even more. This brings us to the ground operation. Everyone expected a massive penetration into Gaza, some sort of big ground operation. And so far, it really hasn't happened. At the beginning, some people were bewildered. Others were outright angry, saying we need to go in and dismantle Hamas, and why are we waiting? Why are we keeping our soldiers on the border? But from talking to Israelis right now, what I'm hearing is that there seems to be a little bit of an acceptance that maybe this is actually, believe it or not, the right way, that we're going about it correctly. The benchmark for big excursions into Gaza, sort of the watershed moment, is 2014, Tzuk Eitan. That's when Israel went into Gaza very aggressively. Many believe way too quickly. A large number of soldiers were lost. I think more than 60, perhaps more than 70. And looking back, it's widely been looked upon as just having been too much too soon without enough planning. And I must say that I am in favor of how it's developing at this pace. It's certainly frustrating when we feel a need to get the job done quickly. But when you look at the fact that soldiers, right now the casualties are very, very low. Sadly, one soldier, a tank soldier, which I relate to personally as a tank soldier was killed, I believe, within the last 24 hours, but it was an accident with a tank rolling over, which once in a while does happen. And we train a lot to prevent those from happening. But in this case, apparently it did, and 2 others were injured. But I think the military is being very careful and going slowly forward and keeping in mind that there might be a possibility of rescuing hostages. I would guess that they're also keeping in mind the fact that Hamas is running, at some point will run out of fuel. From what I've heard, they have enough fuel for the next 2 months. However, what's important about this fuel is not just that it powers buildings and electricity and things we would think, but apparently this fuel also powers the ability to get air, oxygen down into the tunnels. There are about 500 kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza. The soldiers I've talked to who research tunnels have told me there's basically a second Gaza underneath Gaza. And these tunnels are so long that they're not close to openings where air can naturally get in. This fuel is necessary to pump air into the tunnels. And I think Israel is is taking that into account too, that by going slowly, it's actually in our favor, because at some point Hamas literally would run out of air down there. Of course, that also endangers the hostages who we believe are in the tunnel. So there are no clear-cut answers. But what we are seeing is that the IDF is moving slowly south right now to the outskirts of Gaza City. And for the first time, they're staying there. In the past, they would go in, do their business, come back out. Now they're actually staying there, which of course raises questions. Does this make them vulnerable? But the fact that we're there and sitting on the outskirts of Gaza City makes me think that we are building slowly toward whatever this next stage is. And the Israeli government has said that this is the next stage. The second phase of the war has begun. It's not as aggressive as many of us thought, but I think there's an acceptance among a lot of Israelis that this actually might be a good pace after all. So that is that's the ground operation. Now, what are Israelis talking about in general, and as we move into now close to 1 month after this happened? I don't know about you personally. I believe that this is the slowest 3.5 weeks of my life. I never can think of another example of time passing so slowly. And yet there's a part of me that also finds it incredibly hard to believe that it's almost been a month since this happened. I remember exactly where I was when I heard the first air raid siren go off at 6 in the morning or whatever time it was, and it feels like just yesterday. So it's that duality of time that often happens with big events like this. What are Israelis talking about? Well, on the one hand, last week I told you, and the week before, about how the country had collectively decided to put aside the questions of blame and fault and instead focus on moving forward. And that's still happening to a large part. But right now, the questions of leadership and blame are beginning to enter the conversation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but Saturday night, Netanyahu, or an assistant of Netanyahu, put out a tweet essentially putting the blame for October 7th on the intelligence community, on the army. And this was basically a response to people who asked him, are you to blame? There have been calls for him to step down from a few people. And this was basically his way of defending himself and saying, it's not my fault. If anything, it was the security agency who looked at all the plans and didn't do anything. It was the army who didn't take any action. And Netanyahu got huge backlash for doing this. So much backlash that he actually did something he rarely does, which is take down the tweet and apologize. It's worth noting that he's the only major leader in Israel who still has not apologized or said that I bear responsibility. The head of the army has, the head of intelligence has, a number of ministers have as well. He has not. So this tweet is something that Israelis are talking about. They didn't want to talk about leadership and resignations and who's to blame, but I think Netanyahu sort of ignited that conversation by putting that tweet up there and then by taking it down. So why are people now for the first time actually mentioning that he might resign? Why are Israelis talking about a lack of leadership? Well, it's not just a tweet like this or the fact that Netanyahu hasn't accepted responsibility. It's the fact that he's not attended a single funeral of any of the civilians or soldiers who were killed on October 7th or in the fighting after. He did not meet with the families of hostages for a very long time. He finally did earlier, late last week, but only after a lot of pressure was put on him. There's also just some mocking of his attitude, with people saying that he's trying to act like Zelensky from the Ukraine, now wearing only black shirts and black jackets and walking out into the field in a macho way like Zelensky was, and sort of taking his cues from outside. And there's this sort of wondering amongst Israelis are beginning to talk now. Is he really the right leader to see us through this? There's also more and more evidence coming out that he did have opportunities, that Netanyahu did have opportunities to know that such an attack, maybe not this specific one, but that such an attack was imminent, and that he overlooked the evidence. And we'll get back to that in our main area of conversation when we talk about how this happened. The next point I want to mention, what are Israelis talking about? They are actually talking about anti-Semitism around the world. This is actually a new thing. In all the years I lived in Israel, it never really was mentioned or talked about that much. We didn't care. Not that we didn't care, but it just didn't. We didn't pay so much attention to anti-Semitic events. It would certainly make it on the news and it would be in the newspaper, but it wasn't a hot topic among Israelis, unless it was a big massacre like the Pittsburgh massacre, which we just commemorated this past weekend. This Shabbat was the exact anniversary of it. But aside from big events like that, stuff that happens on college campuses really wasn't spoken about. Wasn't spoken about that much. But now Israelis really are starting to notice and pay attention to the amount of anti-Semitism in the world. First of all, they can't help but notice that 100,000 people are turning out in London with pro-Palestinian rallies, and that sometimes some of the chants come out being, anti-Semitic, whether it's, from the river to the sea, which basically means the destruction of Israel. Certainly a lot of Israelis saw what happened at GW University in Washington, D.C. I mean, stuff that happens in campus in the U.S. really, in general, was not spoken about amongst Israelis, except those in academia. And now Israelis are paying attention to that. And that also introduces this weird sort of dichotomy. On the one hand, there's, Israelis always are thinking of like, should I go somewhere else? It's just a normal part of living in Israel is playing around with the idea of moving somewhere else where, even in great times, especially in great times, where it's cheaper, where the jobs pay more, where you can have Target and, Amazon Prime and just all the normal stuff that people get in other countries in the world, but we sometimes feel we're missing out on in Israel. But now there's this other twist, which is Israelis saying, I don't necessarily know that it would be better somewhere else. And I think it's also these scenes of anti-Semitism, from what I hear, are boosting the morale in a way that Israelis in general and soldiers in particular realize that there's more at stake here than just the state of Israel, the safety of Israelis, and the borders of Israel. But once again, that idea of a Jewish homeland, that's the one safe haven for the Jews. This is being spoken about again, while for many years it really wasn't. So, this is something Israelis are noticing that they didn't necessarily talk about in the past. Another big thing Israelis are talking about is just economics. We're at a point where life is not back to normal, but it's slowly getting back to normal. Of my two kids who are in school, one is actually going to school every day, although he's doing at least one bomb shelter drill every day. And one of those days, they actually had a bomb air raid siren go off, and the entire school had to go down into the shelter. School is getting out early for him, though. Instead of 1:30, which is already quite early, he's getting out at 12 o'clock because there just aren't enough teachers. Some are in reserve duty. And my other child, who's school age eligible in high school, her school is Zoom only because too many of the teachers have military reserve duty, which, and that is affecting the country in a way that I love that so much economic aid is coming in. I love that American and Canadian, North American Jews and Jews around the world are stepping up and donating a lot of money. And it's going to go to help rebuild the infrastructure and increase the supply of equipment for soldiers, for hospitals, and all these social institutions. I do worry that not enough money will make it into the pocket of average Israelis, because this is going to affect every Israeli simply on an economic level as well. And I'm afraid that could get lost in the worldwide conversation, but it's certainly something that Israelis are waking up to. University in Israel has now been postponed, I think, until December 1st. Tel Aviv University is offering cash grants of, I think, about $1,000, maybe $1,500 to students who have been called up to the military, especially those in combat roles and combat support roles. A lot of businesses have closed. Fox, which is a big chain of clothing stores and home stores, laid off 40% of its workforce. And my kid was in the mall the other day and said some of the stores are open, but some are closed. And this, it's not as graphic a headline as the horrible atrocities that happened on October 7th. But this is a big long-term effect of what has happened. The economic the economic fallover, the economic result of all these people not working and wondering where income is going to come from. A lot of, middle-aged women with kids, their husbands have been called to the reserve duty. So there's, Israelis are looking out for each other. They're organizing WhatsApp groups to help with babysitting and driving and getting kids to and from school. But by no means has life returned to normal. And because of this, I think it's going to be a very, very long time before it does. And the economic aspect is a big part of that too. And the government's already talked about how it needs to pass some sort of new economic plan, and even more so that it needs to re-examine the budget that was already passed for 2024. This budget included, as you may know, massive amounts of money for the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, large cuts in spending for defense in the South for the border communities who had asked for extra money to help protect their kibbutzim in the South. All of that is going to need to be re-examined. And, I personally think that this could actually lead to a better Israel in the future. It's hard to imagine now, but I personally think that this event was so significant that Israelis will never vote the same way again. They will never allocate money the same way. I think they've realized that having 19 political parties in any given Knesset is a recipe for failure, that instead some of these center-right and center-left parties need to each band together and form larger parties. The way it works in Israel is that if you vote for a party, you don't vote for the person, by the way, you vote for the party. And if your party doesn't get, I believe it's 3% of the vote, your vote is just thrown out. There's no second choice. So you have to play this kind of crazy game where you say, I'd like to vote for them, but I don't think they'll get enough, so I'll vote for them anyway. And we had a few left parties that didn't band together. Merav Michaeli's Labor Party decided not to join with Meretz and some other parties because they thought they could get enough votes on their own. They didn't, and I think a lot of things will change about Israel. For a lot of things in Israel will change for the better. It's painful right now, but how money is allocated and how Israelis vote, I think will be one of them. So now let's get to the main topic of the conversation I wanted to explore today, which is how did this happen? And in a way, I believe we've been asking the wrong question. The question we've been asking is, how did we miss it? How did our incredible intelligence, the Mossad that went down and tracked down the 1972 Munich hijackers that we saw in the movie Munich by Spielberg, this Mossad that was able to do that, and our security services that are able to track down our enemies anywhere in the world, how did we miss this? How did it get past us? And I actually believe this is the wrong question. From what I'm seeing and what a lot of people are seeing, the question is, given what we knew, why did we do nothing? I think it's coming out that we actually knew a lot more than people realized. And I'm going to give you some specifics. I want to preface it by saying that this is a topic I'm a little bit familiar with. I've written 4 books, two of the books actually mention this kind of idea. In my first book, called The 188th Crybaby Brigade, I talk about how we were scheduled to go to Lebanon in the spring of 1998, and how I found our training, I can't even say that it was abysmal, because that would mean that we did anything. I feel that we didn't train. We didn't train to go to Lebanon. We were told over and over that we would do practice ambushes and practice drill, and we never did them for various reasons. The weather was bad, and then one of the officers got sick, and then, okay, maybe they're all legitimate, but you don't send troops to Lebanon without the proper training. And when we had our final meeting before going to Lebanon, we had the division commander come, and they always say, if you have any questions, raise your hand, but it's rhetorical. You're not really supposed to do it. But I raised my hand and I stood up. I was 24. The other kids were 18. And I stood up and I said, look, I don't think we're ready. I really don't think our training was adequate. And he sat me down and he said, look, and I heard this over and over, but what he said was, look, you can learn more about Lebanon in your first 24 hours in Lebanon than we could ever possibly teach you in a month. And I found that attitude, unfortunately, to come up many times throughout the army, sort of like, you'll learn more when you're there than I could ever possibly teach you here. In my other book, which just came out 6 months ago, Israel 201, my co-writer and I, Benji Lovett, thought it was really important to talk about the Israeli character. Our theory is that you can't understand Israel until you understand Israelis, because Israelis think differently than the rest of us. And we give some examples. And some of the examples that we give, I'm sad to say, are extremely relevant to what I think might have happened in Israel right now. There's a certain, in no particular order, there is a certain arrogance that sometimes happens amongst Israelis, especially in the army. This idea that we're strong, the enemy could never actually do anything to harm us. We're the IDF, don't worry about it. This is connected with another very Israeli characteristic, which is sort of yeh beseder, which means it'll be okay. Like, don't worry. A very popular phrase in Hebrew is avalnu et Mitzrayim, na'avol gam et zeh, which means we got through Egypt, we'll get through this too. This is sort of this hands-offish, reckless attitude, like, it's bad, but don't worry so much. It'll be okay. And in one of our and there's also an idea in Israel of cutting corners, that Israelis, there's something in the Israeli culture that likes to sort of cut corners and find the quick, faster way to do it, whether it's riding your motorcycle on the sidewalk to get around traffic, or, when you see construction sites in Israel, they are not protected. They don't have screens, so there's debris falling off the buildings, and there's no police who's really monitoring it. It's many people who live in Israel, Anglos especially, call Israel in many ways the wild, wild west. And there is a sort of wild, wild west characteristic to it, where kind of anything goes. And we name, Benji and I, in our book, Israel 201, we name a few tragedies that have happened in Israel. And we show that one of the reasons these tragedies happened were because people were a little just too relaxed and a little too cut corners and yeh beseder. One of them was the horrible helicopter tragedy in February of 1997, where 2 helicopters crashed on their way to Lebanon and all 73 soldiers on board were killed. And it later came out that the pilots hadn't trained on those types of helicopters, and they turned off their lights before landing so they wouldn't be seen by Hezbollah, but this was not something they were supposed to do. And all these kind of corners were cut, and people were a little too relaxed about official procedure. There was also a disaster at Marom in the north of Israel. I think it was about a year and a half ago, when there were all these pilgrims going up for around Passover time, and the bleachers collapsed, and it turned out that they hadn't been reinforced, and no one checked them. And these kind of tragedies sadly have occurred in Israel too many times, where it turns out that just corners were cut and people didn't pay enough attention. And that's kind of what I'm seeing right here, that the question is not how did this get past us, but why did we not do anything given what we knew? So what did we know? What did we know? One of the most incredible revelations is that in 2016, Avigdor Lieberman actually presented a document, an 11-page document, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he said, this is 2016, 7 years ago, where he said, he basically laid out exactly what was going to happen. He said, Hamas is going to attempt to penetrate the fence. They're going to try to take hostages. They're going to try to slaughter as many people in the south, and they might even try to take over one or more kibbutzim entirely. This happened almost exactly as he described it, and yet when he brought this up in a meeting in 2016, he was dismissed. And he was also told that he was arrogant for thinking this type of thing would happen. And that just strikes me as a very, unfortunately, kind of characteristic of like, we're the IDF. Don't worry. We know what we're talking about. And by the way, when that was dismissed, it wasn't just dismissed by the prime minister. It was dismissed by the heads of intelligence and by the heads of the army who were in that meeting. So there's a wide scale acceptance that just this was not going to happen. And it wasn't taken seriously. I think that's certainly serious, but the just as serious, perhaps more frightening revelation is from these tatzpitaniyot. These are the young women whose job it is to monitor the border. And one of them is the soldier who was freed, and I mentioned her name earlier, Ori Magidish. She was a tatzpitanit. Several have come out in the past few weeks saying that numerous times they were seeing Gazans, Hamas, people they knew were Hamas, coming up to the fence, It looked like they were trying to plant explosives, doing drills with motorcycles and jeeps, practicing taking over a tank. They witnessed all of this stuff happening on their screens. And they said time and time again, we reported it to our officers exactly the way we were supposed to do. And the officers always said, all right, we'll pass it on. We'll take care of it. And it's coming out that sometimes they did, and wherever else it got lost in the chain, who knows? But sometimes they didn't even report it. They didn't even find it worth reporting. But these young women, whose job it is to monitor the fence, for months apparently have been warning that this kind of activity was happening. So it's not a case of how did it get past us? It's really a case of why was nothing done? Now, there's the idea that 20 to 30,000 Gazans were being allowed into Israel every day to work, and that they were collecting intelligence. What we've learned is that they didn't just take over the kibbutzim and the army bases, but they knew where the electricity box was on the kibbutz, so that when they went in, they could shut the power. They had exact knowledge of all these locations. So again, they were coming in to Gaza 20 to 30,000 a day, right under our noses. And finally, there's, well, in July, there was a meeting at the Knesset. And at this Knesset meeting, Netanyahu was warned that all of his judicial reform chaos, balagan, as we say in Hebrew, was weakening the country, and that our enemies were going to find a way to use it, because we're vulnerable, to attack. And that was readily dismissed. And as it turns out, only 2 members of Knesset actually attended that meeting. They didn't even consider a serious enough meeting to warrant showing up. And then there's the night before, October 6th. Apparently, the night before, October 6th, there was a lot of communication between the head of the Shin Bet, which is the Shabak, the Internal Security Service, the head of the army, the chief of staff. They had at least 2 phone calls, possibly 3. Apparently, the latest one being at 3 o'clock in the morning, where they were seeing unusual activity by Hamas, the amassing, again, of motorcycles and jeeps and large numbers of people. And around 3 in the morning, they just sort of decided this is probably just another Hamas drill, and it's not actually anything we need to worry about. They were worried enough that they called a special unit, a small unit, down to try to, at least be ready, maybe 20 people, 30 people, highly trained, but not nearly enough to handle the thousands that stormed through the border the next morning. So what's slowly coming out is that it's not a question of how do we miss it, it's why was nothing done. And I personally believe that one of the reasons that it's just somewhat in the DNA of the Israeli to think that they are in control, to not admit vulnerability, that yeh beseder, it will be okay, and that at the end of the day, we're so strong, nothing can get past us. Because I experienced that myself when I was in the army, and it just, I don't know if that angle will ever be revealed in an investigation, but when asking how this could be ignored, part of it has to be some of the arrogance amongst the decision makers themselves, thinking that they had things under control, when it turns out they actually didn't. So this is the point where I would like to open it up to questions to you. If you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Usually at this time, we've had tons of questions by this point, but this week, I'm not seeing any at all. I'll wait a couple more minutes. So do you see any parallels with the Yom Kippur War? That's a great question. I think there certainly the element, here are the similarities. The element of surprise, the fact that it happened on a holiday, Yom Kippur, in this case, Simchat Torah, and a Shabbat, when a number of soldiers were home. But also the hubris, like the arrogance that, in Yom Kippur, after the 6-day war, we thought we were unable to be defeated. And, we kind of Israel believed that we were strong, that Sahal Yanatzeach, the army can handle anything. And also, we were duped, by Hezbollah had really convinced us that what they really wanted to do was rule over Gaza, stay in power. Here and there, they were going to attack to show that they were still a force. But at the end of the day, they weren't going to pull off anything massive. And, the scariest thing you can do in any type of research is prove your hypothesis. Come up with a hypothesis and then look for the proof instead of looking for the counter proof. And I think what Israel did is they looked for the proof and they forgot to look for the counter proof. The New York Times had an article about Israeli intelligence, and they noted that Israel stopped monitoring the handheld walkie-talkies that Hamas had been using because they thought it was a waste of time. And it turns out when the terrorists were found, their bodies were finally found in Israel after these firefights, they found these handheld walkie-talkies on their bodies, the same ones that we'd stopped monitoring. Wow, and now the flood of questions starts coming in. Well, Sharon Stiefel, because you're an old friend and you raised your hand, I'm going to let you speak. So go ahead and take yourself off mute. Or is that a mistake? Do you have a question, Sharon? No.
I don't. But is that dog still staying at your? Is the dog still at your family's?
Yes, you asked about the dog. I put up a video that our family adopted a dog. This isn't certainly big headline news, the number of dogs who now need families, but there are a number of dogs who need families in Israel, some because their owners were killed or taken captive. In our case, it's a reserve soldier who was called to the front lines, didn't have anyone to take care of his dog, and so we took him in. It's been great. It's been great to help this soldier out, but let me tell you, it's been great for our family as well because it gives my kids something to do. It's a distraction. He's a wonderful dog, and it's healthy for both sides. So yeah, that's one way that Israelis are helping each other out. And I believe that a lot of veterinarians are also banding together and doing the examinations for dogs so that they can be relocated to countries overseas. It's actually very, very hard to bring a pet from Israel or any country into America or other places. A lot of paperwork, but vets are volunteering to help get that paperwork sped up so that some of these dogs that don't have families can to go to families overseas. Should we also ask how the equipment got to Hamas? Also, why won't Egypt let refugees in? That's a great question. There are discussions of how all this equipment got to Hamas. I've heard so many different things, that it's smuggled in through Egypt, that it's coming from Iran, and logistically, I don't know exactly how that would be, that it's coming in ships. Like I'm not sure how they get the weaponry and the jeeps and everything that they do. But the bigger question is, why won't Egypt let refugees in? I think one thing we need to understand here is that the Palestinians someone told me the Palestinians are the Jews of the Arab world, meaning that nobody wants them, that they're a great bargaining chip, that everyone can always complain about the Palestinians and do this for the Palestinians. But at the end of the day, nobody wants the Palestinians in their country. They just want them to keep being next to Israel and causing problems for Israel. So why doesn't Egypt want them? I don't know the exact reason, but this is the history, that all of these countries standing up for them, many of whom, Sinai would have plenty of room for them, but do not actually let them in. Professor Boaz Ganor, president of Reichman University, his think tank, International Institute for Counterterrorism, anticipated the problems in Gaza. Yes, someone texted that to me right now, and many people were predicting something like this. There were even journalists in Israel who were, in the weeks and days leading up to this, were writing articles and tweeting about this unusual activity and how the government needed to do something. We cannot ignore the fact that the government was extremely distracted during these past 9 months with all of the judicial reform, with craziness in the West Bank. We had ministers going up to the Temple Mount, causing problems by doing that, and 25 army divisions were situated along the West Bank. Only 3 army divisions were in the south next to Gaza because of all the chaos in the West Bank at that time. The IDF was also doing raids in Jenin and other places in the West Bank, really focusing on that instead of on Gaza. So clearly the resources were not allocated correctly. Some someone texted, "How do you think it will end?" And then someone else gave a thumbs up. Wow, man, if I only knew the answer to that question. But I sort of alluded to what I think the future might look like. I don't know what the exact end game will be. I don't know who will be in power after this is all over in Gaza. There's talk about the Palestinian Authority. Israel said they want the Palestinian Authority to take over Gaza. The Palestinian Authority said we would only do that if there was some sort of reconciliation for what the status of the West Bank is. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this could be the very thing that leads to a two-state solution. I think Israelis are realizing that we need the two-state solution, not for them, but for us, that we need the security, and there's no way to truly be secure if we don't have a two-state solution. I already mentioned earlier that I think Israelis will vote differently. I see political parties joining together to form blocs that can win an election on the vote. What does that mean? I think only once in the history of Israel has a political party gotten enough of the vote that they simply took power, that they didn't have to form a coalition. In every other election, no party got the majority. And because they don't get the majority, they have to form a coalition with all these smaller parties. And surprise, surprise, these smaller parties are the ones who then make big demands, like no army service for the ultra-Orthodox, or funding for my pet project, or what have you. Only once has a political party actually gotten enough, and it was at least 50 years ago. You can look it up. And I will too, because I'm interested. The point being that I think moving forward, political parties will join together ahead of time with the hope that they can get enough votes to simply take power straight out of the election instead of having to form coalitions. I think we realize the danger of what happens when these coalitions and these small parties get so much control. And I also think that money will be allocated differently. I don't think any leader can seriously look Israelis in the eye and say that the ultra-Orthodox community needs this money for the yeshiva studies, however, the army and the settlers in the South don't. I'm really curious what's going to happen to the South, and I could see this going in two ways. I could see people saying, I will never live in the South because it's just too close and it's the front lines. I could also see a lot of people saying, I want to move to the South. I want to be part of the future. It's going to be safe from now on. Already Benny Gantz, who joined the Emergency Coalition, a former chief of staff, head of the Blue and White Party, has said that he wants to move to the South. And I think you'll see Israelis going in both directions there. And frankly, I can understand both points of view. Question: how to explain the 6-hour delay in sending the army to already known attacks on kibbutzim? This is another one of the huge questions, that if at 6:30 in the morning Hamas had penetrated the border, how come it took 6 hours, sometimes 8, sometimes 24 hours before the army was able to arrive at certain kibbutzim? Part of the answer is known, part of the answer is not known. What is known is that Hamas was able to take over some of the army bases that were closest to the area. So where your reinforcements and your soldiers would be, they were taken over by Hamas, and the soldiers either killed or taken captive. So the first lines of defense were taken over and they weren't there. Why was there not a single Air Force helicopter in the sky? Why did it take so long for other units to arm and show up? That is a mystery that Israelis are still talking about, and we can only hope will come out in the investigation. But it's also one of the big embarrassments here, and one of the things that shattered Israelis' identity, because so much of our identity hinges on the idea that we are safe in the Jewish state because we have this incredible army that is always looking out for us. And even if we don't know what they're doing, they know what they are doing. And so that illusion has been shattered. At the same time, I want to emphasize that Israelis have a lot of confidence in the army right now. And there's no feeling that we're sending a weak army into Gaza or up on the border with Lebanon. It's more about just the way it was run and the failures to take action leading up to it. Question: did anybody suggest Israel agree to a ceasefire if the UN agrees to disband UNWRA and UNIFIL? There have been suggestions for a ceasefire. Israel has said we will not at this time, and the U.S. has backed them, saying this is not the right time for a ceasefire. I personally agree it would be a victory for Hamas if we had a ceasefire now. What I am hearing with regard to the United Nations is that some Israelis have suggested that what really needs to happen is not the Palestinian Authority taking over, but some sort of United Nations presence or some sort of coalition among democracies of the world running Gaza and not allowing Hamas, certainly, or even Gazans to govern themselves. And the logic for this is I think the European Union and the US might be waking up to this idea that Hamas is not just Israel's problem. It's a global problem, both in and of itself and with its relations to Iran, Russia, China, the sides lining up for World War III. So it behooves everyone, not just Israel, to have some sort of United Nations or international presence in there. How much concern is there about other countries and terrorist groups joining in? Well, the big question was, would Hezbollah, specifically in Iran more generally, join in? We've certainly fielded rocket fire from Hezbollah in Israel. There have been bombs launched by Yemen. I don't know if you saw that, but that's news in Israel that Yemen has launched a few missiles. I think it fell in Egypt in any case. But the concern level, I would say, is monitored, but not high. Of course, these are the same experts who didn't see Hamas do anything. But what the sort of word on the street is that Hezbollah wants to show that it's part of this and stand with Hamas, but it doesn't actually want to get into a full on-out attack because Israel, at the end of the day, could just, would be victorious. And also with the United States there and all the weaponry and aircraft carriers that the U.S. has brought to the region, that they don't want the U.S. getting involved. And so Hezbollah wants to sort of make some token bombings, but not necessarily get full out involved. For the time being, it really still is a one front conflict. Someone said, "Thanks for the books. Because of them, I now understand the region better." Well, hey, thank you for saying that. Do I know what happened to the small soldier group of about 20 soldiers that was alerted to increased activity near the fence? Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that around 3 in, they decided to bring that small group of crack soldiers down to the border. I believe all, if not most of them, if not all of them, were killed. They were just simply overrun. What do I think will be the end result of this war? We already kind of got that one, so I'll skip forward. How did Avigdor Lieberman get that Hamas document? So that was not a Hamas document that Avigdor Lieberman presented. That was something that he wrote himself based on intelligence and based on his assessment on what the enemy was doing. Avigdor Lieberman is sort of seen as a hawkish Israeli, though I think a very competent one, a good legislator who really, truly loves Israel and wants to defend it. But he's seen as hawkish and sometimes dismissed as being too hawkish and too much of a worrywart. And but that was something he put together himself in 2016. And he's saying right now, by the way, sort of apropos to the previous question, that Israel is not concerned enough about Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, and China, that we need to be taking those more seriously and not just fall for the, in his words, like the old paradigm that they're just doing some token moves, but don't really want to be in it, but that they're preparing for something big. So but to answer your question directly, Teme, he put that together himself. So a question, how can we directly support Israelis that need money? That's a great question. I wish I knew how you could easily do it, but also in a way that makes it easy for Israelis. I know a number of Israelis who are simply collecting money from friends. My wife is collecting money from friends in the US, which she then uses to buy food for people in the neighborhood and clothes, underwear. She bought 500 pairs of underwear for soldiers and sent them down. She's making sure to buy from certain caterers because a lot of caterers were giving away money for free, preparing meals for free to send down to soldiers and for people who'd been displaced. But the one that my wife has been working with, they said to her, we're going to have to close. We can't keep doing things for free. So she's raised money so that we can actually pay for some of these meals. I think it's weird to send money directly to people because there's just no, tax record and you don't know exactly, you can't be sure exactly where it's going. But I would say find someone in Israel who is working on a specific project and send money to them. And especially if they have a PayPal account, which that way you can send to them and they can withdraw in shekels and you avoid the whole conversion thing. Now, look, I also know that Jewish United Fund, Jewish National Fund and Jewish Federation have massive programs right now where they are trying to disperse money not just to communities and to infrastructure, but also to individuals who need them. So probably, at the end of the day, I think JNF and Federation do an excellent job of allocating their funds. It's always a safe bet to go with them. And you could call your local federation. That's a great thing to do. Call your local federation and say, hey, I want to help Israelis on the ground, the one whose businesses are about to close but haven't yet because they need a little more money. How can I help them? And they might be able to help to put you in the right direction. And I'm also just going to put I've put this before in past sessions, but it's the website that a few friends of mine have started, supportforisrael.com. And it's a list of all the various organizations that they have vetted, that they know are doing a good job, broken down by category, whether it's military, hospitals, education, even in therapy. I mean, the mental health need is already very great. So I think the main takeaway here is not just give now, but this is going to be at least a 10-year project as the country rebuilds itself and also as Israelis rebuild themselves. Wow, tons of questions here. Let me see.
Hey,
I'm
Joel,
try to, someone.
Joel, what was the name of that website? Because that wasn't the right website.
Support. Did I?
Supportforisrael.com is not.
Yeah.
That's not it.
Support the number 4 Israel.
Oh, the number 4.
Support the number 4 Israel.com. Are you seeing that? Now you are. Was that Neil Katz?
Maybe.
Yeah. So Neil, if you could look through some of the questions that are further down and sort of categorize them, like put a few together, and then I'll come to you in a minute while I go through these, that would be really helpful. So I'm looking at sort of the next questions. How are the most affected receiving psychological help to heal, including Zaka volunteers? Zaka is the CSI group, the crime scene investigators group, who are going through going through the bodies and trying to identify them. And Zaka volunteers are saying that they are seeing things that they have never seen before. It's already been concluded that there are a number of bodies which probably will never be identified, simply because between the mutilation and the burning, too much was done to destroy any possible DNA records or dental records and the like. And this is taking a huge psychological toll on them as well. I do know some therapists in Israel are offering free services and stepping up, but that doesn't speak to the massive need for mental health that Israel is going to require in the future, whether it's soldiers on the front line or the hostages who are coming back, or even just children who've had to hide in bomb shelters, during school. Every child takes that differently. I'm very open with my kid, and he's scared, but I think doing okay. But there are other kids, he told me, who really panic and who start hyperventilating and crying when they have to run down to the bomb shelter. And, that's a psychological toll too, even if it's not necessarily headline news. I don't know. I can't answer this and know what the solution is right now. What I can say is that it's a huge, huge question and something Israel will have to address. Because I've always believed, and I wrote this in Israel 201, that Israelis we walk around with PTSD. I mean, every Israeli, when the book came out, I said every Israeli who's at least a year old has been in a bomb shelter. And now every Israeli who's every Israeli, you can say, has been in a bomb shelter at this point. There's not a single one who has, and probably multiple times. And every Israeli knows someone who was either killed or taken captive in from October 7th. They've needed volunteers to dig graves because there simply aren't enough grave diggers in Israel. So the psychological toll is very high, and we're going to have to address that too. I think the good news is that we're ready to. In Israel of past, it was always seen as macho to not cry at funerals, to not get upset about this, but to be hard and you're a strong Israeli, and it is much, much more accepted now. And I'm doing a fundraiser this week, this Thursday night, November 2nd. I'll be in New York City raising money for an organization I love called AFINS. I'll put it right here, afins.us, and you can still attend if you want. It's at the Jewish Museum in Southern Manhattan. And what they do is they help Navy SEALs after their service. So the Shayetet, the Israeli Navy SEALs, these are some of the soldiers who do the hardest work. Their training is 5 years. They've already done a number of high-profile raids into Gaza, and you can see some of their videos online that they shared. But one of the things that AFINS does is they provide a buddy line. It's called Buddy Line, where they're paired with a former Navy SEAL just as a buddy to talk through what they've been through. They pay for therapy, and Israel is finally waking up to the idea that PTSD is real, and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to cry and to process these feelings. There's another great organization I've worked with and done shows for, and they're slipping my mind, but I'll find them for next week. But I think the good news is Israelis are ready to talk about the psychological aspect as well. Okay, great question. We plan to make Aliyah in December. Would waiting until January make any difference? It's almost a comedic question at this point. I mean, only in Israel would you consider moving to a country going through a war and maybe delaying by 3 weeks because that war is going on. I commend you for your desire to make Aliyah. I encourage you to do so. Personally, this is just Joel sitting in a chair saying this. I'm not an expert, but personally, I think that the situation in January is probably going to be pretty similar to the one in December. If you were to say June or a year from now, then it might be a little bit different. That said, for the most part, most Israelis in Israel are safe. And from a safety point of view, I would say that, you would be okay moving soon. I don't know what the housing situation is. A lot of the vacant apartments in Israel have been taken over by families who've been displaced. I think 200,000 Israelis from the south have been displaced. So, there's the whole housing question I'm not familiar with, but, make Aliyah. I personally believe that one thing we need is more Aliyah. We need more Jews from around the world moving to Israel, Jews with educations and know-how and skills, just to make the country stronger that way. Sending money is certainly wonderful, but bringing in really high-quality Jewish people to build up the country, that's a great way to do it too. Tengav in Israel helps individuals and was created by a Canadian woman and an Israeli. So yes, Tengav, that's I've heard of them, which means, what does Tengav mean? It means give it back, but it doesn't really mean that. It's more like give us a hand. I don't know what the website is, but I'm going to put Tengav right here in the comments. And if you just Google Tengav Israel organization, that should probably help.
Tengav is give back.
Give back. Yeah.
And they tell you exactly
where it's going.
If it's going for a fridge or if it's going for their rent or yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I missed that translation, but now that I hear it, it makes perfect sense. Okay. Where can one volunteer as a therapist? I do not know, but that's a question that I'm going to take a screenshot of that question, so I remember to ask it, to look into it for next week. I know doctors can sign up to volunteer to go over to Israel if needed. The idea being that Israeli doctors would be called to the front lines, and so doctors from other countries who are certified could fill in on the rounds in the hospitals and the clinics. I don't know if they've actually begun calling them yet, but doctors, EMTs, and nurses, you can sign up. I don't know about therapists, but I will look. Will this be a real wake-up call for the military? Someone asked. Yes, I think it will. I think there's no way it can't be. I think a lot of things will have to be re-examined, including how serious we take our threats, but also the fact that Gazans could get up to the border with Israel, that there was no buffer zone keeping them away. That's got to be re-examined. I think the idea that technology will always win, that idea will need to be thought about differently. We had all this awesome technology, but one thing Avigdor Lieberman warned about in 2016 was that we were putting too much reliance on our technology and too much reliance on the wall. the wall separating Gaza from Israel. At the end of the day, they were able to penetrate the wall. They were also able to shoot out the cameras that monitor their activities. They were able to fly in using hang gliders or what have you. And so a lot of low-tech things were used to get around all of our high-tech supposed advantage. That's going to have to be re-examined. And also just the whole chain of command. How many steps it keeps getting passed along in this game of telephone before the signal gets lost. Important way to help Israelis, Rachel says. We all have friends and family there. Reach out to them on a regular basis. Email, calls, text. The method doesn't matter. The main thing is to ask how they're doing. I agree with that. And I'll also say, for all the questions about how we help and how we give, I think the more important thing is just give. Like, at the end of the day, that's more important. What concerns me more is the people who don't give. I think as long as you're in the category of people who are giving, that is where we want to be. Two questions together. What is Hamas doing in hiding? And are there any negotiations going on now to trade prisoners for the hostages? Great question. What is Hamas doing in hiding? You know what? I really don't know. They are in hiding. We do sort of get the sense that they might be panicking because they're saying we want to do prisoner exchanges. We want more fuel. That makes us think that maybe whatever Israel is doing is working. But what are they doing in hiding underground? Look, this underground it's built up. It's concrete reinforced. They have weapons down there. So they could also be preparing and moving hostages around. Nobody knows for sure. But they're underground. I think that's what most have agreed. Also, are there negotiations going on now to get the hostages? Every day in Israel, we are hearing that Qatar is talking to Egypt and is talking to Hamas, and there's all these things going on behind the scenes. I do believe that there are hostage negotiations going on behind the scenes. I don't know how much Israel is involved. How much is it without Israel? How much is it with Israel, but off the record? Hamas has said that they want an all-for-all prisoner swap, which would mean all Palestinian prisoners who've been convicted of crimes in Israeli prisons exchanged for all of the hostages currently in Israel now. Israel said that that was not a serious ask. If it were a serious ask, they would have paid attention to it and done it. Yeah, I don't know if they really would have, but Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said that it wasn't a serious proposal and that if it were, they would do it. Yair Lapid says that they stand with the government in any kind of hostage swap. But again, we have to go back to 2006 when Gilad Shalit was kidnapped, sat in Hamas captivity for 5 years in Gaza, and more than 1,000 prisoners were let out in exchange for that one Gilad Shalit. Some of those prisoners went on to commit murders of Israelis since being let out. So it's a complicated question. Even if we have a prisoner swap, how much are we creating a bad future for ourselves, a more dangerous future by doing so? And I think to a large extent, it hinges on how much we can actually destroy Hamas now and incapacitate them, and who takes over Gaza later on. But the hostage question, it really is at the forefront of Israelis' minds. And one story today in the Times of Israel was that the ground operation is going slower than planned or slower than anticipated because we're taking concern for the hostages and we don't want to ruin our chances of getting the hostages out alive. But what we can all agree is just how complicated the hostage situation makes it. Now over 230 is the number that's estimated there. That is where I'm going to call it off for this week. There might be a few more questions, but I'll write them down and address them either in a future newsletter or in next week's session. I really appreciate your joining and your asking the questions. The questions is really the engine for this session, and it shows me what you're interested in as well, so I can prepare for next time. If you have any feedback or thoughts, something you'd like to see, please go ahead and email me. I'll put my email here, joel@joelchasnoff.com. If you're not on my mailing list, that is where I send out the links to these conversations, is just www.joelchasnoff.com. And also, I'm sharing a lot of interesting content about what's going on in Israel on my Instagram feed and on Facebook, which is @JoelChasnoff. I've been showing examples of humor believe it or not, there is humor going around Israel. I talked about one example last week. There's other social media posts that are really going wild throughout Israel as people laugh not at the horrible conflict, but laughed at the absurdity of being Israeli in this moment. And it's really a beautiful thing to see. So if you like that kind of stuff, go ahead on Instagram and Facebook and join me there because I like sharing that stuff. Thank you so much to all of you. I'll see you in a couple days on Thursday or Friday with Hebrew is Magic, the newsletter, and should have the link for next week's conversation at that time. Until then, rak b'shalom. Toda rabah.
There, please.